So Hannah, why don't you tell me a little bit about your story and how you got involved in this amazing documentary that you've just released?
This is my first feature, so I've worked I have more of a background in experimental shorts.
Okay.
Um, and I worked in film for the last 8 years.
Uh-huh.
So this is my feature documentary debut. I guess it started in lockdown. I sort of moved back to where I grew up for the lockdown time, which is in the middle of the countryside in France,
Brilliant.
and started creating a rhythm with some daily walks, listening to the podcast by Matthew Bannister, Folk on Foot. And through that, slowly discovered the musicians that are around the Spell Songs project. Um, and eventually also saw their online festival that they did to raise money during lockdown for musicians.
Mhm.
And Jackie Morris did the painting of the otter that she does during her performances in the Spell Songs live concerts. And I found myself crying because there was something about her or their approach to being extremely sensitive in the way that they were looking at reconnecting with the natural world and its words, but also being extremely accessible. I think that followed me quite a bit until I saw them perform under the well in the Natural History Museum and realized that it was still giving me a lot of emotional reaction. And I thought I really want to collaborate with these people, but also somehow find a way to translate that emotion to screen so that even if it's, I'm not initially not a great um, folk enthusiast, so I don't come from that background, but it was more along the lines of what if we can create a film that, at least by the emotion it conveys, can catch people empathetically at one point throughout the narrative, lending lots of voices to the natural landscape of the UK and using it as an example as to how one small territory can come alive with voices and inspiration and different ways of approaching reconnection to the natural world.
How did you start it? Did you start with writing or did you start with some imagery? I mean, how did it come together?
Um, I started writing in the sense where I contacted the writers, Robert Fallon and Jackie Morris, quite fast after that. So I had to write a proposal of what we would potentially do. And looking back on it now, it's not that different from what the film became. It kept its initial sort of form and inspiration. But within the first 6 months, we were managed to go to the UK and do preliminary interviews, talk to Robert and Jackie, um, and see a lot of the landscape that we were eventually going to spend a lot of time in. So both of them combined, it's a very collaborative project. So, going to take imagery with the DOP who has a very expansive vision of landscape from the extremely micro to the macro, with the drone to macro insect shots. I think, even though we worked in quite close collaboration, she really brought a lot to the table in terms of how to bring this film alive. But just as much as then the editor, when we were in the editing room, even though I built it up through a lot of pre-edit work from all the interviews, because more than 100 people participated.
Mhm.
So we were going through a lot of material when I got to pre-edit. But the creativity that the editor brought to the table also helped hinge a lot of the story. The recordings in nature using very creative ways of capturing natural sounds, geophones, hydrophones, all these um, recording tools that really work empathetically with natural elements. So, you only get sound if you record a tree in the wind or, rocks in the sea. So you need contact between materials and events in nature. So it felt like a lot of it was working with what was happening around us while we were there. So a lot of it was also written with the landscape and with the people who participated and were there to record and capture and be immersed.
And what response have you had from some of the participants? I mean, particularly somebody like Robert McFarlane, has he given you some feedback?
Yes, they've all been extremely supportive, and I think from the very early on when we presented them with the different strings holding the potential protagonists together, they had trouble imagining where we're going with the questions we want to ask, that were much bigger questions about our position, our anthropocentric position. And so they were waiting to see what shape it took. I think they all came back with very sensitive reactions of being surprised, pleasantly surprised by how the story hinges, which has been really gratifying. And but at the same time, we're very lucky that for this whole time that we worked on it, them including, I mean, the whole following, so all the people who actually got on board without knowing what the film would be like eventually, and also Screen Scotland and the people who supported us throughout, they all took a bit of a leap because this film was very difficult to describe.
Yes.
But they've been very, very, very supportive since it came out. So it's been wonderful.
Do you find a significant groundswell of support for the message of saving and restoring nature, or has it gone on the back burner like it seems to have done politically?
Politically, a lot of things are always going to be limited on sort of a policy scale or on a higher scale. But I think, in terms of communities that get involved together, that is quite hopeful. I mean, even just in the UK and just reaching out to people now with the film to potential.
Right.
There are many people that are fully engaged, and that's how you work with the environment. We do hope that still we can potentially have an effect on a policy level, but I think that to have that sort of effect, you have to continue to build this empathy with the more than human world, which is what this type of film is trying to do. I mean, we don't want to take away from the idea of crisis because that needs to be acknowledged. But I also think that we need to stand firm with the idea of hope, and we need to be able to feel with the landscape and not just for it. So, and I think that a lot of initiatives have been taken now because that has been realized, this, the great divide between us and the human world, making it quite difficult to reconnect.
I think a lot of people would agree with you. I love the way that you use children's voices there. The children always put a smile on my face when they talk about the obvious things about nature and the wonder they find in it. It makes you wonder what happens as they grow up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think initially at the real start of the project, there was already this idea of how can we bring children's wonder into adulthood, because there is that moment of cut off that is, that just happens, or that we let happen. And I think that that's something that the book really translated as a possibility of rekindling that wonder or carrying it through time or age, in a sense where it was a book that was supposedly lent to children's eyes, but because it didn't dull down the language, and because it was such a beautiful object, and because it had such grounding in such a sort of urgent example of how we can erase collective memory around an environment and the understanding of our direct environment, then, that book really had the potential to bring that wonder back to life. And I think it did for lots of people.
So will you stick in the future with these kind of topics, or do you have other things in mind now?
Yeah. I mean, I think they will always be trying to push some of these questions further. So we have, we'll be working on an immersive piece for quite a few years on the side of Lost for the Words. That is initially based in the Irish landscape, but the idea is it will be a prototype that can be translated to different landscapes and used by different artist collectives as a way to really not only enter the landscape, but actually step into a state of landscape and really exercise that cognitive empathy that we sometimes don't have access to when we're working with AR or VR, which often just triggers emotional empathy. So the idea is really to push people to work with that empathy. And I think, Lost Words was sort of a trigger for that in a sense where we were creating this immersive piece for cinema, but the cinema room has its limits and we wanted to go further than that. I'm also working on a shorter piece with my mother and planting trees in Abernethy Forest. She's an artist, so we're working together, looking at the contrast between the hope of looking several generations ahead and the lack of hope sometimes when making art or making films with the hope of somehow impacting people. So those are still intertwined with my work, but some other themes are more linked to identity, sense of place, and that's sort of the other side of my research. But everything sort of collaborates in a sense where it's all about how in a hyper-connected, globalized world, one can find one's place and how one can connect to place.
What are you doing in terms of distribution? How will people get to see the film?
So it's going to we hope it is previewed to go all the way to the end of the year, maybe even early next year in terms of festival sort of trajectory. With the cinema release, hopefully late winter, early spring next year, and then the idea is that it will not only be released in cinemas but have a strong impact campaign that will bring it to more remote areas, with community screenings and sort of collaborations between local artists and scientists, and sort of giving people the tools that they can use to come walk back into the landscape around them and find that wonder again. And then further along the line, we're hoping also to bring a short mini series to life that would be for a younger public, focusing on the sounds of nature and musical responses from artists. And that would permit us to touch a much sort of larger public through institutions that would also like to use that material to involve the young audiences and so forth. And so, since we've been working quite close with them throughout the filmmaking, it made a lot of sense to continue to collaborate through the impact campaign.
So Hannah, thank you very much for your time and for this chat. And I wish you very well and say thank you very much.